Well, Darin, no, it's great connecting with you again. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me about Dodgebomb and everything that you put into it. It's writing a book is obviously a very much a serious endeavor for a lot of people. I'm sure like it took you a lot of time to put that together. But what I want to do right now is just if you don't mind, just take a moment, introduce yourself, do a little elevator pitch, if you will, about who you are, where you're from, even what you're doing now, just so people can get a good understanding of who we're speaking with today.
Okay. Well, hey, hello everyone. I'm Darin Pepple. I'm originally from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I grew up there, and when I was 18, 2000, I enlisted in the Army. After a few years in the Army, I got the opportunity to go to West Point, which was awesome. And I graduated in 2007 as a second lieutenant field artillery, and went out into the Army and served in the Army until about 2015, which then I decided to get out and go pursue other things. After sort of reaching that milestone in 2015 of being a captain and a battery commander, I was looking for kind of the next stage in my life and had started to get a little, I guess, disillusioned with the garrison army. So I decided the next best thing to do would be to go to school, and went to Washington, D.C., where I went to George Washington University and got a master's in business administration. And I graduated in 2017 from there. And since then, have worked in the area as a defense contractor, IT project manager for General Dynamics, IT, obviously managing big defense contracts for the government.
Interesting. Well, that's actually, there's a lot to talk about with your background, which I think is really neat. Especially as I got in the book, because I noticed, because you were a field artillery officer, and I know I'm trying to pace this conversation, so to speak, but would you mind just taking a moment, so prior enlisted, like what was your MOS when you were prior enlisted?
I was actually, if you believe it, I was an air defense artillery guy, and they had Bradley, which is a light tank and infantry fighting vehicle, and there was a Stinger pod on the side for shooting down airplanes. And so I was everything on the Bradley, from loader up to driver to gunner, and then go to West Point and still wanted to be in combat arms because that's where the fun is, and got into artillery. And then that was all indirect fires, right? It's cannon, rocket, mortar fires. But then the actual sort of interesting thing is, then you go out into the actual Army and you may or may not do that. So when I was in my first tour in Iraq, I was a fire support officer, with a cav troop, to bring in the indirect fires to support us. But in also actuality, I was a platoon leader, and we were essentially mechanized infantry and scouts driving around, looking for bad guys and dodging bombs. So that's kind of how, here's what you are on paper, and then, oh, actually, you're going to do this and be doing just a Johnny of all trades for anything else the Army tells you to do.
That's really interesting. Well, I mean, it's really funny hearing this from you, because I don't think we've actually talked about ourselves, about our past together as far as being in the Army. And, I was, being a field artillery officer, of course, we ran into each other at Captain's Career Course, which was fun. And it's just really funny just to kind of, recap a lot of these experiences, especially in your book. I had a lot of fun, going through that. But what I thought was really neat was just reading what the experiences you had and just recognizing the differences. So when you deployed as an officer, you only deployed once as an officer, is that correct?
No, I deployed 3 times, twice to Iraq. First in 2008, second in 2010, 2011 during Operation New Dawn, to kind of wrap up Iraq. And then actually a third time to the Emirates, right outside of Dubai, where we had our rocket launchers just essentially set up over there in case anything got weird. So 3 very different deployments to the Middle East.
Interesting. Yeah. So I imagine the 2008 and 2010 deployments were significantly different because of, it almost sounds, if I had to guess, the Dodgebomb experience kind of lends more towards the 2008 experience. Is that right?
Correct. Because that's when it's the surge in the war, and you're still seeing how U.S. forces are figuring things out. And it's past the 2003 invasion where we just crushed the Iraqi army. But then now we're starting to see the, ascendance of Al-Qaeda, but also as a counterpoint to that, the Iraqi government's starting to become into existence. And then you have the Sunni and the Shia Arabs, in Iraq that are actually trying to fight Al Qaeda and other sort of jihadist forces.
Right.
And it's just a very interesting and strange time because we're still with like this let's hunt bad guys mentality, but then we're also reconstructing Iraq. So
Right. Yeah. So it's two things at once that seem otherwise, on like polar ends for the most part. And so I guess my question to you is this: with respect to, writing Dodgebomb, you have a lot of I'm really impressed with how you were able to just differentiate all the different types of personalities that come across from top to bottom, going all the way from field grades all the way down to the lower enlisted, and you just able to basically find show like what that spectrum of personality looks like across the board. Like how are you able to just like recall a lot of those memories from Iraq as you're putting this book together?
I did keep a war diary for all my tours, so that helps to go back and reference things. But I think I just had such very visceral memories from my first tour and from these larger than life personalities, because most of them in the book are based off of real people, primarily from that first tour, but also some from later in my career. So some people may say it was very like deft characterization and writing. I think it was also just trying to remember these real personalities and people and just describe them best instead of creating them.
Right, right. Yeah, because that way people like me, like, when I read this, when I was reading about, Lieutenant Colonel Gutierrez, right? Like that's a very specific, there's a very specific type of field grade officer that exists in the Army who's very much like that. Who it's like the the amount of times I roll my eyes just like reading about him, it was just it was no surprise to me. Like I immediately thought of other people that I knew in the Army, and it just seemed like it was a bit of a mixed bag. And so like it sounds like your experience with field grade officers wasn't necessarily the best. Is that how you summarize it? Like how do you talk about that?
Yeah. As very cynically, that's how I would characterize my experience with field grades at the end of my Army career. Actually, during the time that Dodgebomb takes place, most of the field grades I run into are amazing. And you'll see there's Major McAdams, who's also based off of a colonel who's in real life, and he was phenomenal. Everything you wanted out of a field grade to support you. I would say the lackluster field grades that I sort of put into the book are more ones I encountered later, unfortunately, out west in Fort Lewis. And that's probably kind of the reason why I'm out of the Army to this day. So that cynicism kind of pervades, but made for some great story writing.
Oh, for sure, yeah. No, that's really neat that you kept like a war diary. So when did you start doing the war diary?
War diary would be very brief. It would be date and major events. We met with Sheikh, whatever today. We, had to call EOD or there's indirect or something like that, whatever sort of prominent events. But as the tour goes on, I start to put in notes about frustration and, observations and things. So at the very least, it's just sort of a timeline. But there's some of the emotions and feelings still baked into that, which helped then for writing Dodgebomb.
Oh, that's great. But you didn't. So was it strictly something you did as an officer, or is it something you did as enlisted?
It was only as an officer. I never deployed when I was enlisted, fortunately or unfortunately. So yeah, and I just took one of those little green books that we all had, and just every day, if I had time after patrolling or whatever, and just write sort of a summation of what happened that day.
Yeah, because what's interesting is because I think, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, like your 2010, 2011 deployment. That's actually when I deployed as well. So it's kind of crazy because I'm actually coming up my 10-year anniversary of coming home from that deployment this next month, or in August, I should say. And what's funny was the one thing I noticed that was kind of lacking in the book, or at least wasn't necessarily as emphasized as much as what I remember from my experience, was the incoming alarms, right? Mm-hmm. And that's, and I point that out just because that was probably the most significant, experience I have with like contact, if you will. But it sounds like you guys were, or at least the experience you had, in 2008 was more, kinetic operation, as I said, going out, trying to find the enemy, trying to find, Al Qaeda and Iraq and what have you, versus 2010, 2011, where it's more like, okay, we're going to rebuild Iraq, we're going to do all these projects, these payment projects?
Yeah. So think about, so our, and my similar experience is 2010, 2011, we're on FOBs, right?
Yeah,
Whereas during the surge, troops are pushed out into the villages. So we're on COPs, we're on patrol bases. And of course, those sort of systems aren't really in effect. If you get mortared, you just get mortared. So that indirect, like scene I have in the beginning of the book, that's when the protagonist, he's coming into a FOB, and it's only really at the beginning and the end of the book are they on FOBs, and the rest of the time they're on small little bases that don't have those bells and whistles.
right,
And
right.
don't tell you to duck, right?
Yeah. No, that's the thing, is that like, and that's something I noticed too, is because you didn't have FOBs necessarily. You had cops and what have you, and patrol bases, but nothing was really built up, and that was kind of like one of the talking points with like, oh, we need to build this up so Lieutenant Gutierrez can look really good, to brigade command and this and that. And it's like, okay,
Yeah.
interesting. So one of the things I wanted to here's something that I noticed with the book too, is that you chose the paradigm of an armor officer, but you were a field artillery officer. So what made you decide to do that? I found that a very interesting take on your experience.
One, I think it was because as soon as when I did join the CAV troop as a fire support officer, my troop commander was like, "You're CAV, we're all CAV. Everyone here is in CAV, regardless MOS."
Yeah.
And then I thought, as an armor or a cavalry officer, for someone who is a military generalist or civilian or just doesn't really understand those nuances, we can nerd out about well, this is artillery and this is armor. I thought it was just a good sort of and best way for to get that general feeling of what being a combat arms officer was in Iraq. So it just worked, and it was either sort of armor or infantry would make the most sense, and in effect, we really were all armor officers or mechanized infantry. So that's why I went with it.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. And that reminds me of just the experiences that I heard from people across the board, both Iraq and Afghanistan, where sometimes people, for example, guys like us who are field artillery officers, we're sometimes plucked and say, oh, you're going to go with this rifle platoon, and you're going to be the platoon leader of that specific platoon. So, and it's kind of like, and I guess one of the lessons I got, and I'd love to hear your take on this, is that especially, well, at least my deployment 2010, 2011, you're kind of, I guess the consistent theme with being an Army officer is you're going to do whatever the Army tells you, whether it's you're leading a cav troop or cav platoon, what have you, or you're going to be being doing these payment projects along the way. It seems like that's something that I guess young officers in particular should be prepared to do. Where there could be that possibility where you might not be doing that necessarily. You might not be doing the job that you're hoping to do, is what I mean to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also kind of the nature of counterinsurgency, right? Is that you just chase the problems you're given and figure them out the best way possible. I think now maybe the modern military is more, siloed and more, stricter on, okay, you're really going to be an artillery officer.
Yep.
But as you and I both know, it's just, wars change all that. And at the end of the day, you're an officer and combat arms, rather than I'm artillery or I'm infantry. I can't do that because that falls out of whichever category.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that was kind of part of the reason why I got out of the Army ultimately, when I did, or at least things that helped influence me to get out when I did, where it was I was with 3rd Brigade 1st Armored Division out of Fort Bliss, Texas, and there wasn't necessarily, we're supposed to go to Afghanistan to turn off the lights, is what they were saying. And so in my mind, I'm like, okay, I'm basically going to go back to do the job that I did in Iraq as a field artillery officer. I'm not liking how this sounds because I'm not going to be doing the job that I was hoping to do. And then plus like the queue for battery command was like really long over at the brigade. So I was like, it's gonna be a long time before I get battery command. So this is probably a good time to get out. Writing is on the wall. So that was basically my experience. I want to take a moment just to kind of to pick your brain on what started Dodgebomb. Is Dodgebomb actually the first thing you've attempted to write, or have you tried writing other books?
This is my first book.
Oh, cool.
I've written short stories and a lot of cynical anecdotes. As you remember, when we were at school, I wrote a funny bathroom newsletter, duck droppers, But this is really my first formal work I would say I've ever done.
Okay, interesting. And so when did you first decide, you know what, I think I should write Dodgebomb? Like when did that take place roughly?
I think so. 2014, I was pretty much done with the Army and was starting to mentally sort of wrap my head around what was next. And it was, as you know, it was just difficult. So I just, as a like venting mechanism, just started to write down little vignettes of here's what was stupid today with the Army
Yeah.
bureaucracy or whatever, some humorous, some terrible. And then once I got out of the Army in 2015, and I was like, okay, the next step is business school and pursuing that, I really realized that I wanted to write a book to talk about my experiences and also relate those war experiences to just sort of average Americans. Because I had started writing these things down, but then I realized when I got to business school and just started talking to, average Americans who hadn't, ever been in the military or any connections, there was this just huge disconnect for what like military service was and what
Right.
deployments overseas was. So that was then kind of the real genesis and driving force that, okay, I'm going to write this book. I'm going to use it on the backdrop of my first tour in Iraq because I think that's what's interesting and how I can best, tell the story. And then I'm also too, I'm going to put it in a relatable, approach so that anyone, whether former military such as ourselves or a civilian, can read it, enjoy it, and
Yeah.
understand this, epic event in American history. And that
Right.
was the whole start, I guess, really of it, from scribbling down little frustrations with some
Yeah.
field grade to no, I'm gonna start this project and whatever it looks like, I'm gonna finish it.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. And then did you like leverage any type of like resources, any books that kind of help you put this together? Like what was like you what was your go-to resource if you had any?
Oh, well, first off, and as you know from just our military network, is reach out to other military writers
Right.
because you would be surprised, or you wouldn't be, just how much if you ask somebody in the military who's done something before, whether it's writing a resume or writing a book, they're going to be upfront, share you pros, cons, everything they've
Yep.
learned. So I reached out to a couple of veterans who had written books and been sort of successful, and they gave me all their best practices. I also looked, I like to read, and I actually read a lot of, war books. And that's also too kind of the genesis of this, because I felt the current sort of Iraq and Afghanistan stories out there didn't fully capture the experience that we went through.
Right.
And I looked more heavily into like World War II books, to be perfectly honest.
Oh wow.
Like Kurt Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse Five, Norman Mailer, the Naked and the Dead. I thought these were just beautiful, tragic, and compelling books that talked about the World War II experience. Why couldn't we have something for Iraq and Afghanistan along those lines? And then, yeah, I just and then sort of started writing and used the authors and those books as the initial sort of model for where I wanted the book to go.
Yeah, that's interesting because like one of the things I've learned along the way is, and that's because I'm trying to get into writing as well and do my own thing. Like so like just I'm not sure if I share this with you, but like and, or for those who are listening, watching, when I got in the Army, I wanted to pursue a creative career. I still very much still want to do that, and I'm doing it on my own in a way. But one of the things I did along the way was I was a writing intern over Walt Disney Studios for about 6 months, which was pretty fun. And in the process of like trying to get in there, because I want to be a filmmaker, still do. But one of the things I learned along the way was, after reading a whole bunch of books, is that Hollywood, for example, they want the same but different in a lot of ways, and that's essentially what you have done in this particular instance, where you're leveraging books like you said, like Kurt Vonnegut, and putting those together, where it's okay. Let me look at see what Kurt did, and let me try to see if I can make sense of it from where I'm sitting right here. So
Yeah.
That's really cool. Okay. Yeah. Anything else to add that?
But yeah, so and this is a complex question, so we can probably go back and forth for a while though.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Well, something else that I've noticed with the genre of Iraq or Afghanistan is that it's mostly Hollywood cliches, right?
Yep.
There's very few good books or movies that capture the experience. It's all everyone was a Navy SEAL, sniper, has crazy PTSD, you know. And I like you, I mean, I've picked up plenty of books and started watching plenty of movies. And at first you're like, and then you're like, oh, this is terrible.
Yeah.
And and so after like, and then again, when you talk to people about like why the Hurt Locker sucks, and it's just not realistic,
Yeah.
because at some point he just becomes special forces for no reason,
Yeah.
and again, civilians, they don't get that. They think we're all, and that's awesome, but they think we're all these Green Berets running around doing crazy stuff, and the actual story is a bunch of regular guys going through complex situations, doing mundane, but also sometimes very scary, crazy things.
Right.
And that's the story I wanted to tell and change the kind of the current narrative that
Right.
everyone's PTSD, sniper, who just can't handle his stuff after he gets home from killing thousands of jihadists.
Yeah, it's funny because like all the mundane stuff, even one of the things that made me laugh as I was reading Dodgebomb was just seeing the mention of Vienna sausages. I was like, it just made me smile. I will say I'm a little disappointed I didn't see anything about Rippets or like wild tigers or
So
unless I missed it.
there is a quick reference to Rippets in the beginning, where before a patrol brief, the one NCO says, "You can't drink a Mountain Dew, you can't drink a Rippet.
Yeah.
You have to drink a water."
Yeah.
But yeah, and that's awesome too that you say that, because hearing other veterans when they read my book, there'll be certain little moments that trigger things.
Yeah.
And one of those was like Rippets, where a buddy was just like, "Oh man, did you ever do like a Rippet challenge?" And I was just like, "Yes, I did do a Rippet challenge. It gave me Rippets I could drink." And just these like little moments that it like brings out that we all had.
And then and what's really good about that, and I think you capture this in the book too, which I think is really neat, just being able to take moments to connect with soldiers on a very human level, which you don't really get. I mean that's something that's also seems to be missing from the main narrative, mainstream narrative, as far as like the boring moments. So, for example, like watching soldiers play Grand Theft Auto, for example, like and then just all the sound bites that you catch while you watch them play, right? Which can be very entertaining, because soldiers are like, I always tell people this, like soldiers are some of the funniest people on the planet.
Of course, yeah.
What the things that they just ad lib in the moments, it just hysterical. Okay,
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and that's some of the anecdotes, and that's also some of the humor I tried to capture in the book, because I find most war novels, they take themselves so seriously,
Right.
and we know obviously war can be a very serious thing, but it's people going through this, and to maintain their sanity, they want to crack jokes about Grand Theft Auto, or quote movie quotes, or like talk about whatever. And that absurdity, I feel, is often lost in other books, because it's just like, no, we were Navy SEALs once and awesome. End of story.
Right. Yeah, and I think what's also really interesting about what you've done too, and I think the only ever time I've seen this was, I think when we read at the Academy, Army at Dawn, by, it was a Rick Atkinson, if I remember correctly, and where they highlighted the politics between like generals, for example, like Patton and Eisenhower didn't necessarily get along very well. Whereas, and then, but in your book, again, like, falling back on Lieutenant Gutierrez, like just the politics that took place where, getting mad at Captain Holt, for example, for, going too early. It's like, no, you should have done it this time, where it's just all the absurdity that the absurdity behind, those type of interactions, which come out, which really, it creates a lot of cynicism. So I'd love to hear more about that, by the way, just like what's, with regards to the cynicism, like what do you think? Do you think that's something that people really would help better understand what the Army is all about in general?
Yeah, I mean, well, the Army is the largest corporation in America and a huge government bureaucracy, right? So there's this absurdism, and there's also this bureaucratic, norm of just making things so difficult sometimes to get
Right.
done, and also the fact that it's government and not private. Sometimes metrics are just based off of phantasms, right? And not like money or anything sort of quantifiable. So that's where you often sometimes get into absurdities in the military, where it's, we took the town, we killed the bad guys. Yes, but we didn't do it according to the brigade top 15, fighting points, and you're like, why does that matter?
Yeah.
But you see people get so sort of indoctrinated or just into that own little world that they can't think past then anymore what matters, because they become a careerist, they become a bureaucrat, and that, and I wanted to capture some of that absurdity and sometimes cynicism in the book, because although this book is about, the early fight in Iraq before the bureaucracy sort of took over, that's what I found towards the end, right? And that second deployment to Iraq, or later in my Army career, is that it wasn't so much anymore about results or war fighting, or how well you can shoot your weapons anymore, or do any of this like classic Army stuff. It was
Right.
all just, how good can I look to the brigade commander? How much property have I turned in? How good are we for resiliency and
Right.
other, just impossible to gauge metrics that then these later field grades, base their careers upon.
Right. So have any of your friends that are still in active duty read the Dodgebomb yet?
Yes. Yeah. And you just kind of want to know how they feel, or like,
Yeah, yeah. Like I know I'd love to hear, because those guys are definitely at this point committed to having a career, and I'm just really curious to see what they say about especially especially their field grades now, right? Like your
yeah,
classmates are field grades now, so I'm sure they have some interesting thoughts about what you wrote.
yeah. I was actually surprised, because I was expecting that former sort of field grade, this isn't kosher anymore. Like, you're going against the company line,
Yeah.
and I have, all our friends are making major now,
Yeah.
or are majors, and I was actually very pleasantly surprised. Most people still really like the book, and they think it harkens back to when the Army was the Army, about just fighting the bad guys and not worrying about all the politically correct sort of, nonsense or bureaucracy they have to deal with today. I also have a few colonels, who were still my former bosses when I was younger. And I was also very intrigued with their response, because they also liked it. They and I really expected, 05s, 06s colonels to be like, whoa, you dared criticize the Army. How dare you guys? But no, I actually got the only critiques I got from them would be like, they'd be like, well, I was there for that tour and you fictionalized this part. I don't agree with that. And be like, well, that's fair. Like, or you killed this guy when he didn't die, and that was a surprise or something like that. Where I guess they were looking for more of a, just true account of what the deployment was, instead of
Right.
a fictionalized Iraq war novel. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, yeah. And I guess, but to your, in defense of you, like changing things up a little bit, and I think this is also why. I mean, but this is also why we get the Hurt Locker, for example, is they kind of sensationalize stuff just to make things a little more interesting, but you also do it just to try to convey a specific point along
Correct.
the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a part of the objectives. So
And
yeah,
if we didn't fictionalize, also some parts would be very boring, right? Because nobody wants to read a book about, like, we sit around for 4 months and nothing happened until then later in the fifth month stuff happened. Like, people don't
yeah.
want to read about those boring 4 months.
Yeah, and just standing around watching. Oh my gosh! I would love to see a book on your second deployment. that would be less exciting.
I don't think that would sell. I think it would sell like one copy.
Yeah. Well, cool. And then so So with respect to just, creativity, is this something you're trying to get into even more so now, or is this just like a one-offer for you? Like what's the plan now that you've wrote Dodgebomb?
Well, so it's actually both, Andy. To be enigmatic, because this was like a life goal to get this story out, get this project to completion. And if it's successful, and with the help of your interview today and your viewers, then if I become a bestseller in Oprah's book club and I'm selling 10,000 copies, then yeah, I'll pursue it more as a career, and chase later creative projects. But if this is all there is for me, then I'm pleased and satisfied, and I'm going to keep my day job to pay the mortgage until this is over. Because the great thing about this book is, again, my goals were to relate what the Iraq War experience was,
Right.
and also to, sadly and kind of ironically, the real Bushmaster troop, 6-8 Cav, their tale of this deployment for them was actually lost, because as stupid Army bureaucracy, some staff officer didn't give them credit for their deployment. So having then written this book and then still being part of that sort of alumni and the reunion with that Cav troop, a lot of the veterans there have talked to me about it, and they appreciate that I wrote this book because it at least tells their story and it's not forgotten. Because the events in this book, like the Battle of Zambernia and other things like that, because some staff captain misfiled a report, was actually given to a completely different unit in 3rd ID. So if this is all there is, and then I've at least accomplished that, then I'm good, and then I can retire my creative genius.
That's really cool. I mean, I guess that's another good thing about putting stuff together like this after going through deployments and what have you, and being able to. And I guess that's what's great about creativity, is having the ability to share something that you've done with other people, and then they're able to kind of reciprocate like what you've done and worked so hard on. But I think what's even better is the fact that you're kind of giving something people to remember the deployment by in a very meaningful manner, which I think is really cool. Yeah, so that's really neat. Now, when it comes to writing this book, what was the hardest part about putting this together?
I think I honestly, and this probably would just be sort of the whole process, but I think publishing. So writing is difficult, because if you don't have a good idea, if you don't have that sort of creative spark, yeah, right, you can't do the deed. But getting this project to kind of fruition. So I'd finished the manuscript in about 2019, and then it was like, okay, I'm ready to publish. What does publishing look like? I don't understand that space, how you do that.
Right.
So I had to essentially, I figured step one would be I'll edit it. So I self-edited it, and then I realized that I needed to bring in a separate set of eyes, somebody else to edit it, or else, since it's my baby, it would never really be up to snuff.
Exactly.
Because I couldn't criticize myself that much or enough.
Yeah.
So I brought in, and I started looking at editors, and then I realized I kind of needed to get an editor with military experience, or else all these inside jokes and all this sort of, stories would kind of be lost on your average, author from Manhattan or wherever, because they just don't understand, the military culture and sort of our space. So I brought in one of our West Point classmates, who's actually an English professor there now. And I thank her in the beginning of the book, Renee Farrar. And I reached out to her and I said, here's my project I'm working on. Could I, pay you to essentially edit and help me figure out how to publish my work? And she agreed to it, thankfully.
Cool.
And then with her, we had to sort of decode of what is publishing, because I think everyone's sort of aware of the old framework, which is you would get a literary agent, they'd pitch your book to a big publishing house like Simon and Schuster or Random House or whomever, and if they like your book, then they put it out on bookshelves.
Right.
And then there's self-publishing. So it was just like, okay, well, how do we do that? So went through that process of to get a literary agent. Like if you're a Hollywood actor, you have an agent, right? That agent sells you that says, I want Andy to be in this movie. You get picked up. That's how you get your work. For a literary agent, you essentially send them a cover letter and an excerpt of your book. And if they like you, then they try to find you work and they try to sell your book to publishing houses.
Right.
So working with Renee, we did that and we sent them out to like 30 different literary agents. And through that, then I realized that's the old way the industry works. And no one cares if you have anything new and fresh to say. And that then you have to sort of go into self-publishing.
Right.
Because unfortunately, the industry only wants to publish you if you're a celebrity or you've written Harry Potter 2 or something that's kind of already been done, right?
Exactly.
So then I looked into the self-publishing space. And self-publishing is there's either Amazon or there's others out there. And what I had to learn was that because there's people pitch different values of either one, and Amazon, it's huge, but you shouldn't go with Amazon. You give up, they had different misnomers about Amazon. But I realized with all these other self-publishers, you need to pay them upfront money to publish your book. You need to pay them a few $1,000s, and then they'll edit it, and then they'll package it, and they'll put it out. But you're essentially paying them to do the final part of the work that you've mostly done yourself.
Right.
And then looking into Amazon, I realized with Amazon, they don't need any upfront, payment or anything. They're just going to take their cut after it's published. And it's in your favor. It's like 70-30, 60-40. You actually get, as a self-publisher through Amazon, you get a bigger share than you would if you go through a literary house. So decided to go with Amazon, and then working with Renee, finished up all the editing. And then there was other things we did, but that was pretty much it then. Once we got the book edited to an acceptable level, had cover art, and then had it formatted, I essentially just needed to put it up on Amazon, hit publish, and then 2-3 days later, I have a searchable work that all my friends, the family, everyone in the world can find just by searching Amazon. And however maybe simple that sounds, of just sort of like plodding along and working with a person, that probably took like 1.5 years of just sort of discovery to figure out how like self-publishing actually works.
So just to summarize what you just said, so just publishing took 1.5 years. And then, so how long did it take you to actually, complete Dodgebomb, like from start to finish, before you even got to that part?
Oh, before probably about 7 years. So really started in 2014, and then it was published late March 2021. And so 2019 is when the editing and then the finalizing and the searching for how to publish it sort of all began. Yeah.
So grains make a heap. It's like just little by little over time for sure. Yeah, I've heard. That's got to be one of the coolest things about Amazon offering the self-publishing, right? For example, where I've heard like from people who have written books, for example, where if you go through a publisher, it can also take a really long time before your book even hits the market, even if they do select you. Like I hear like on average it's like 2 years before you'll even see that. Of course, they're ramping up the marketing. Have you heard about that at all by chance? Is that something you took into consideration as well?
Yeah, and it's also, and I obviously then it got to a point where then I could no longer take it to consideration because no literary agents wanted me. But it's the right time to publish, and I figured that approximately 2021. Especially with us pulling out of Afghanistan and whatnot, it would be a kind of a refocus on those wars and would spark new interest. But yeah, you're at the whim of somebody else if you go with a traditional publishing, and perhaps they can move more copies that way. But with Amazon, you have complete control, which is pretty cool for, again, this like massive big corporation that people sort of disparage.
Yeah, exactly. No, and I think also the thing I heard about publishing too is that um, I think you actually make less if you sell a lot of copies. Like I guess like the margin you make on your books is actually even smaller because of how much effort they're putting in on this, and they're putting your face everywhere. And I think, for example, like you can't be a New York Times bestseller unless you work with some of these publishers or work directly with New York Times, which go figure, right? So that's something interesting I've learned too. So let me tell you this, like having gotten to the point where you are right now with Dodgebomb. Well, let's just start in general, just maybe some career advice. Like, what kind of advice do you have to people who are just getting out of the army in general? Like, if you could go back and do it again, what might you have done differently?
Yeah, for people getting out of the army wanting to chase creative careers, or just sort of in general, just transition, or is that what you mean?
Yeah, just in general. That's the first part of the question. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's you shouldn't just get out of the army and just jump into the workforce. You need to decompress, and you need to sort of like find yourself and find the next step. And whether it's you want to be a creative writer or go into business or do whatever, I highly recommend you go to school if you can, if you have that time. Um, and also to travel a bit to sort of just, process what it all meant. Because you're going from, one completely different culture and world to another. I would probably say that my biggest regret from what I did is that, in hindsight, it's like, okay, I want to publish a novel and make it great. I would have, in school or just on my own as sort of a side, I would have taken some more creative writing courses.
Hmm.
I feel that, I caught up, and had enough good examples and resources to help me on that. But if any of this could have been defined earlier for me, maybe it wouldn't have taken me 7 years to write my first novel.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, because that's something I learned too. I mean, for me personally, it's I guess the issues I ran into it just trying to find the right people too. And I think what's good about this, for example, is people can find me or you and have that conversation. But hey, what should I do?
Yeah.
How maybe you could be like a mentor to someone to get through at least a process for some of this stuff. And that's one of the things I probably, I mean, it's different for me though, because I'm married, right? I was married when I got out of the army too. And so I kind of had to, support my marriage in a way. And I was kind of, I grew up in Southern California. So it was really convenient for me to live, with my in-laws, because my in-laws also live here too, as well. So my wife and I lived there for a while, and we tried to take advantage of that. So I, did unpaid internships. I did, for example, I did, fellowships that paid barely anything to try to explore that stuff. And then it got to a point where it was like, okay, this runway is really short right now. I got, I have a life that I still have to live too. And so I went and I kind of jumped in the workforce again, and I kind of did it haphazardly. And my current day job is I'm a sales guy. But I will say this though, what I like about sales though, and I think you'll probably appreciate this too, having gone through the process of writing a book, putting it together. It's sales is a lot of problem solving, and I talk about this, and it's the Thayer method, right? Which when we're at the academy, it's so easy to be cynical about the Thayer method, but in all honesty, what I've learned is that it's all about taking initiative, right?
Yeah.
Take initiative and trying to stay ahead of the problem, if you will. And so that's what I got out of sales. But at the same time, was you have to be creative to do really well in sales too. So I think that's something that I learned along the way for people. So with that being said, like with Dodgebomb, so like you don't have any ideas for books right now that you're kind of thinking about, like hemming and hawing about, like maybe I could write about this, or maybe I could do that.
Oh, so that's also probably sequels would be a lot easier than the
Yeah.
initial, right? And you get all the crude army jokes too, like where all your buddies that are still in or whatever, and like then the sequel should be, Fitz comes back to Savannah, Georgia, and he marries, a girl he's known for a week, and he gets a DUI, and or later in his career he goes to career course or whatever, and then is taught about MDMP or whatever, just crushing, boring, military crap. I think that would be funny, sort of, but I think there's room for maybe a better book about transitioning out of the Army and out of the military. And if I could do that in a humorous, interesting way, continuing to sort of analyze that civilian military disconnect and the differing values that I'm sure that you see and still feel to this day, that could potentially be a good book. So we'll see. That's maybe where I'll go if I make this a bestseller.
Well, the thing is, I think that this is, I mean, what I've learned with like these creative projects, right? Like one thing I learned with like Crypto Cartel, like my game, is that like it's, I picked that deliberately as like a small project to build off of, right? And I think that's something you could easily do at this point, because I mean, do you mind sharing like how many copies you've sold? Like,
yeah, so I've sold about 450 copies right now.
Woo! Wow.
Well, it's funny because you see these New York Times bestsellers and they're like, we only sold 11,000 copies this week or month or whatever, and I want to get it to be more, right? But that's really the hard part of sales, as right?
Yeah.
You get an initial momentum, an initial push, you get into some of your networks and circles, right. And then after you have that, getting and gaining those new customers, that's really hard. So, so now I might only sell like a book or two a day, and it's slow and steady. So that's why, again, Andy, I'm glad I'm doing this with you and other things, because it's hopefully I can get the word out there and someday sell a few thousand copies of Dodgebomb.
Well, yeah, I think it's only uphill if you keep going. Personally, that's what I think. For you. So I do. I do have an idea. I want to pitch you for a sequel. Here real quick. Yeah. So here's my fun little moment with you that I'm going to share with you. Hold on a sec here. Bear with me.
Right.
Okay. This is the movie. Okay. This is the movie you got to pitch. Okay. Right here. Boom. Right there. There we go. Dodgebomb Part 2. They sent him on a mission and set him up to fail, but they made one mistake. They forgot they were dealing with Fitz. Boom, right there. There's your movie.
Dodgebomb Part 2.
Part 2. Yeah, I had some fun with this one right here. I had to kind of keep the conversation interesting.
Andy, you've written my sequel for me. Just I don't even need to think about it anymore. I appreciate it.
The movie, and that's the thing. We can just go straight into the sequel as a movie, right? Just go into it. And sequels just blow up box offices, more so than the original one, right? People rush to sequels. So
and you see the writing for sequels, right? It's so poor compared to the original. We just slap something together, just like throw some army on it, and people will love it. So
yeah,
perfect.
Yeah, definitely. Darin, this conversation is great. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we get going here?
I mean, I probably want to do a silly pitch for it, just, so I can say like,
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, everyone. Hi. Something along the lines of, hey, for a realistic, relatable account of the Iraq War that dares to deviate from Hollywood cliches, pick up Dodgebomb, Outside the Wire in the Second Iraq War by me, Darin Pepple. It's worth your time.
Absolutely. It's a great book, especially if you're a veteran, who's deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan, even for that matter. I think it's just a really great time, just to look in that book, because it'll recall a lot of, the cynicism, I think, with the cynicism comes a lot of wisdom that I think is really worthwhile. And I think because you get a lot of the lessons learned, which is really good. And then do you have any social media plugs you'd like to share with us, or we still got you?
Yeah. So, I have a website, DarinMichaelPepple.com, because of course Dodgebomb was taken. I'm on Twitter as Pepple_Darin, Instagram, DPEP America, DPEP America, at Instagram, and pretty much any of those, my Twitter account, Instagram accounts, Facebook accounts. I have a Facebook author page. You just look up Dodgebomb on Facebook. There's an author page that, I'll post ads and latest sort of things like this interview I'll put up there. So that's probably the extent of the social media out there to share with everyone.
For sure. Awesome. Darin, I want to say thanks for taking the time to connect with me, share with me Dodgebomb, deployment, military stuff, creative stuff, especially because I know that's something that's even more unique within our, I guess our community, if you will, among veterans, because not very many veterans even get into that. A lot of them just kind of go run the mill.
Yeah.
Especially the officers that get run the mill corporate jobs, and so it's so niche. And so, with that being said, I really enjoy this conversation, and I look forward to what comes next, my friend.
Well, thank you so much, Andy. Really appreciate your interest, your help, and I wish you the best of luck as well for all your endeavors, because you do much more creative stuff than just my one little book. So, thank you, man.
I appreciate that, man. All right, thanks a lot.